After the last video I did on shooting micro four thirds for the last 5 years, the things I'd learned, I got a great response from that video. There were a lot of people with a lot of positive comments. It was really great to read some of that. But there were a couple people that disagreed. And they wanted to tell me how I needed, a camera with a bigger sensor and more dynamic range and all that stuff. And I fell in the trap of arguing with one of them and went back and forth several times. And finally, I just took my own advice, cut it off. Stop listening to the noise, right? But this all got me thinking about, what does it take to make a good photograph? Do you have to have a fancy new, digital camera with all the features and whatever to make a great image? Is that what does it? And I think the answer to that is no. And I got thinking about some of the really great photographers whose work that I've admired, like Henry Cartier-Bresson, Alfred Stieglitz, Margaret Burke-White, David Douglas Duncan, Robert Capa. I mean, the list just goes on. And there's just so many great photographs that have been made with extremely simple cameras. Just cameras that, they didn't have a whole lot more than a simple lens and a shutter and a, way to focus it. I mean, there just really wasn't a whole lot there. And one of my favorite photographers that I love his work is a guy named Tony Vaccaro. Now, Tony, during World War II, wanted to be a combat photographer, but when he tried to enlist and sign up to be a combat photographer, they basically said, no, we don't have a need for more combat photographers, gave him a rifle and sent him, off with the infantry. So Tony, though, was determined that he was going to take photographs. So he landed in Normandy. Now, he was not there on the D-Day invasion, that landing, but he was there shortly thereafter. But he landed in Normandy with an Argus C3 camera. Very simple. You've probably seen one of these called the Brick. And he took this camera all the way across Europe to Germany, to Berlin, went to one of the concentration camps, took thousands of pictures, was processing his film and, like dipping and dunking it in helmets at night, and scrounging film and chemicals from little towns they'd go to from either the pharmacy or if they happened to have a camera shop, he'd try to get some supplies. And he just took this simple little Argus C3 all the way across Europe, taking pictures of the war. And some of his images are just incredible. I mean, they'd be in a battle, he'd have to pick up his rifle and do that work and defend themselves or whatever they were doing. And then when the shooting was over, he'd pick up his camera and start shooting with that. And just took some amazing pictures. One of the interviews I read with Tony was saying basically if it hadn't been for this simple Argus camera, he didn't think a more sophisticated camera would have survived it. His camera got beat up pretty badly, but the camera just took a lot of hits and kept working. The thing that's incredible is this lens, this Centaur lens that these come with, and his, being made prior to World War II, didn't even have a coated lens. It was uncoated, a 3-element lens, 3 elements, a cooked triplet, you might say, and took some amazing photographs. And I think that it's just important to remember that, it's not the photographer, the camera that makes the great images, it's the photographer. Anyhow, anytime I see Tony's work or think about him, I just want to pick up this Argus C3 and go out and take some pictures. It's just a simple little camera. So I think that's real important to remember, is that it's not the camera, it's the photographer. I think it's way too easy to get caught up in this technology. I took a break from photography and came back and decided I wanted a digital camera and ended up landing on the Micro Four Thirds by Olympus, and I really love these cameras. But I went through this process. I'm trying to do this on a budget. I didn't want to buy the most expensive lenses. But I went through this process of examining the quality I was getting from all these lenses. At the end of my kind of film photography days, and I'm still shooting film, so it never really ended, but at the end of that kind of era when film photography was being replaced largely by digital, I had a whole bunch of Leica equipment with great lenses, and I sold that equipment partly because I needed the money and partly because I felt like film cameras were kind of on their way out, and I didn't really have the foresight, I should have, to realize that at some point those film cameras are going to come back and be worth a lot of money. Now those Leica cameras, had I kept them, would be worth so much more money than they are today. But you know what they say, 20/20 hindsight. So anyway, I went through this process of examining images, you know, blowing them up on the screen, and am I getting enough resolution? Is the contrast, you know, all this stuff, and I really got caught up with that, and I realized that what I was failing to do was really work on how to take great photographs, you know, what really makes a great photograph. And I decided I needed to break myself of this thinking about the technology so much and start again going back to thinking about what really makes a decent photograph. And so I got into pinhole photography, and I took this old Olympus 6, I bought this at a thrift store, a little folding camera, and the lens and the bellows were just terrible, rotten on it, and the lens had fungus in it, and it's not savable. So I took the folding part, the door off the front with the bellows and all that stuff, replaced it with this metal plate, mounted a little pinhole behind it, and made a pinhole camera. And this has worked just famously. It's really wide angle, it's like 28 millimeter focal length, which on a 6x6 centimeter negative is really wide angle, a lot of fun. And I started shooting pictures with pinhole and thinking about the subject and the composition and lighting and exposure and energy and mood and all these emotion, all these things that would make an image really speak to me when I took it. And so pinhole photography has really been a big tool in doing that. I've now got several pinhole cameras. I've got some 4x5 pinhole cameras, and I've got a 6x12 Holga pinhole camera and another twin lens pinhole camera that I made. But pinhole photography really just, I mean, when you shoot pictures with a pinhole camera, there's no lens. It's a tiny little pinhole, you know, in this case 0.2 of a millimeter, I think it is, or something. And it creates an image that, you know, obviously you can see what's in the image, but it's not sharp at all. It's, well, pinhole images are really unique in that they have infinite depth of field. Everything is in the same level of focus, and yet nothing is really sharp. If you've never studied pinhole images, I really recommend you do that. But, you know, I went down that path so I could kind of break away from thinking about lens resolution and pixels and all this technology stuff and refocus on what actually makes a good photograph. And so I went, like I say, I went down that path. I started doing pinhole photography, and that really, to me, it kind of broke me of it. Now I can look at my digital images and go, yeah, those look great, they're nice and sharp, whatever. But I don't really stress or worry about, does that image have enough resolution? Is it sharp enough? Is it good enough, you know? I've never had anyone admire one of my photographs and say, that was a great image because it had lots of dynamic range. Or, wow, I really love that image because it was just super sharp, the lens resolution is amazing. That's not why people admire pictures, never. And, well, maybe other photographers, but the public at large, they don't think about any of that stuff. When they look at one of your pictures, they think about the subject and the emotion that they get from it, how it makes them feel. That's what's important to them. So I think that's an important thing. It was for me to break away from thinking about this technology, find a way to do that. And it might be a little bit different process for you than it is for me. You know, some people go the route of getting a Holga camera. I bought one of these recently. I'm gonna start playing with it. It's a little sharper than a pinhole lens, but not a whole lot. So, but it's maybe a little easier to use. It has a viewfinder, and you know, but the Holga cameras are super popular. The other thing is get back into shooting film cameras. You know, find you an old Argus C3. Not too long ago, I bought this Russian Zorky 6, and I'm going to be doing a video on this. Is kind of a cool camera. Very basic rangefinder camera. Amazingly, the Russian lenses are pretty good on this. I'm kind of impressed. Paid like $60 for this rangefinder camera, and it works great. So, you know, whether it's going back to simple film cameras or pinhole or something like a Holga, there's a lot of ways that you can kind of take a break from the technology. If you don't do anything else other than buying a pinhole lens that you can put on your digital camera, which will turn your digital camera into a pinhole camera, you just don't have to process film, you can get that effect. Now I know there's, like my digital cameras have a pinhole mode, but it doesn't look anything like pinhole. Largely because a real pinhole has infinite depth of field. Everything is in focus, and yet nothing is, which is kind of weird. But Find a way to break away from thinking about the technology and just to focus instead on the process. Composition, subject, exposure, you know, the mood, the energy, the emotion, all those things that make a great image. Learn to focus on those things. So, you know, great images are not great because of the equipment that's used to make the images. Great images are great because the photographer did the right things to create a great image. I had an aunt who was a music teacher, and this is kind of an interesting example. Anyway, we were talking about how, you know, a violinist with a great violin, you know, is going to sound better than a great violinist with a cheap violin. And she's like, well, wait a minute. Turns out she spoke of two different violinists, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was either Fritz, I think it's Chrysler, or Jascha Heifetz, two great violinists. Both of them had Stradivarius violins, you know, priceless violins, but people would sometimes say, oh, it's not, you know, if anyone could play that knows how to play the violin could play a Stradivarius, they're going to sound wonderful. And that musician, whichever one it was, took exception to that and decided to prove that wrong. So he played a concert with a cheap violin and played this concert, and at the end of the piece he was playing, everyone just cheered and applauded. It was so beautiful, you know, standing ovation. Everyone thought it was great, and then he threw that cheap violin on the stage and stomped on it, broke it, just shattered it. And the audience just gasped, you know, oh, he's just destroyed his Stradivarius. Well, no. And the point he made then to the audience that it was a cheap violin. It wasn't the violin that made his music sound great, it was the musician. And I think that's a great example of, you know, like what I'm saying, it's not the camera that's going to make a great image for you. It's not the number of megapixels or the size of the sensor or the resolution of your lens or any of that stuff that's going to make a great image. It's not. It's what you do with that equipment. And like I say, you can take this kind of equipment, you know, the fancy electronic, big sensor, whatever you got, and you can make great images with it. I'm not saying you can't, but I'm saying if you're a really great photographer, you'll be able to take this Russian Zorky 6 and make great images with it. You know, you could take a pinhole camera and make great images with it. No, I mean, the technology is almost zero. So I think it's just so important to understand that. And so I would challenge everyone watching this, if you are thinking about, you know, how do I get better at being a photographer? How do I, you know, become a better photographer? How do I make images that, you know, have greater appeal? I think you have to focus on those basics. You have to focus on your subject matter and composition and lighting and exposure and, you know, how to create an image that has emotion and mood and energy and all these things that connect with people, that make people feel those images and, you know, connect with them emotionally. It's when people connect with an image emotionally that they really love the image. So anyway, I would challenge everyone to get a pinhole camera or get a Holga. These things are pretty cheap, and get out and take some pictures. If not this and you really want to do digital, get a digital pinhole lens. I'll put some links in the description down below for some of this stuff if you want to explore some of that. But at the very least, get a pinhole lens for your digital camera, and get out and take some pictures and really focus on those things that we're talking about and see what you can create. I would challenge y'all to do that. I would love to hear your comments about any of that. I hope you'll have more questions and more comments. I would just love to hear how some of you have done with some of that. Well, I hope that was interesting. Again, just kind of a quick follow-up to last week's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Again, leave me a comment. I always enjoy it when you do that. And as always, thanks for watching.